Hi, my name is Fraser Solis, and my group will be going over Chapter 1 of Jenna Schmielek's Limitless book. When most people hear the Federal Reserve, they usually think of an institution that feels distant, technical, and hard to relate to. They think of interest rates, inflation, banks, and economists making decisions somewhere in the background of the economy. But Chapter 1 of Limitless, called The Before Times, is arguing that the Federal Reserve is much more than just a quiet institution adjusting numbers behind the scenes. It is one of the most powerful forces shaping how the economy functions, especially when the country is moving toward uncertainty or crisis. So when Jenna opens the book this way, she's not just introducing the Fed as a financial institution, she's introducing it as an institution whose role had already grown far beyond what many people usually imagine. In other words, Chapter 1 is less about specific policy decisions and more about the broader position the Fed had to come to occupy in American economic life. The core idea of the chapter is that by the late 2010s, the Federal Reserve had entered an era it was no longer just seen as a body that quietly managed inflation and adjusted interest rates in the background. It had become more visible, more involved, and more central to the way people understood economic stability and the overall direction of the economy. What makes this chapter important is that it sets up a shift in how we are supposed to think about the Fed. Schmielek is showing that the institution was already being pushed into a larger role before the next major crisis fully arrived. The chapter presents a Fed that had more responsibility, more public attention, and more public influence than ever. The growing role is what makes the rest of the book possible. Instead of asking only, what does the Federal Reserve do? This chapter pushes us to ask bigger questions, such as, how did the Fed become this powerful? What kind of role is it supposed to play in the economy? And what happens when one unelected institution becomes so important to keeping the country economically stable? Because those questions shape the rest of the chapter and really the rest of the book. So the biggest message of Chapter 1 is not simply that the Federal Reserve is important, and it is not just a profile of Jerome Powell as chair. The bigger message is that the Fed had already grown into a more powerful and more publicly significant institution before the next crisis fully arrived. This chapter lays the foundation for the rest of the Limitless by showing why the Fed's role had become so large and why so much would soon depend on it. In the next parts of this podcast, we'll build on the main idea by looking more closely at how the chapter explains the Fed's changing role, how that plays out in an example, what common misunderstanding the chapter pushes against it, and what the biggest takeaways from Schmielek's opening chapter.
Hello, I'm Junie, and today I'm going to be talking about the key mechanism in Chapter 1. Imagine you're a pilot of a massive $20 trillion jet. You're flying through a storm and you have one primary control, the throttle. You want to maintain a steady altitude, but if you push it too hard, you'll climb too fast and the engines will overheat. That's basically what inflation is. If you pull back too far and you stall and fall out of the sky, that's what a recession is. Now imagine that the neutral position of that throttle, the spot where the plane stays level, changes every few minutes, but the dial on your dashboard doesn't tell you where that spot is. In the world of central banking, that invisible sweet spot is called the neutral rate. As Jenna Schmielek explores in Chapter 1 of Limitless, this isn't just a variable in a textbook. It's the most important number in the global economy. For a decade, the Federal Reserve was flying with the wrong coordinates. To understand why this matters, we have to look at the old map. For 40 years, the Fed operated under a set of assumptions built in the 1980s. They believed that the neutral rate, the rate that neither helps nor hurts the economy, was around 4 to 5%. This belief dictated everything. If the Fed kept interest rate at 2%, they thought they were flooring it. They were terrified that by keeping rates this low, they were overheating the engine and inviting the ghost of the 1970s inflation back into the room. So whenever the economy started looking good, the Fed would reflexively hike rates back up towards that 4% mark, trying to get back to the neutral state. But as we enter Chapter 1, something strange happened. In the late 2010s, the Fed is hiking rates, trying to get back to that 4% neutral target, but the economy starts sputtering. The stock market tanked in late 2018, more importantly, inflation. The thing that was supposed to explode remained stubbornly low. Schmielek takes us into the Fed's headquarters. They realized the engine of the American economy had fundamentally changed. Because of an aging population that saves more, slower productivity, and global shifts in capital, the neutral rate hadn't dipped. It really collapsed. Instead of 4%, the neutral rate was likely closer to 0.5% or even 0%. This realization was a eureka moment, but it was also terrifying. If the neutral rate was 0.5%, it means the Federal Reserve almost had no room to fight a crisis. In the old days, when a recession hit, the Fed would drop rates by 5% to jumpstart the heart of the economy. But you can't just drop rates by 5% if you're already starting at zero. This central tension of Limitless by the end of Chapter 1, Powell realizes that the Fed's old tools, just moving the interest rate down, are no longer enough. The neutral state of the world had become a lower bound trap. To save this economy in the future, the Fed wouldn't just need to tweak rates. They would need to become a buyer of the last resort for almost everything. Chapter 1 ends with the Fed that has finally thrown away its old map. They stopped trying to find a version of neutral that no longer exists. This shift in perspective from boring interest rate managers to limitless economic protectors is what set the stage for a massive intervention we saw in 2020. The pilot finally realized the plane had changed now. They just figured how to fly it. And that's the conclusion for the key mechanism in Chapter 1.
Hi, today I'm talking about a real-world example from the book Limitless. This example is about what the Federal Reserve did during COVID when the economy started going really bad. This matters because during big crises like COVID, the economy can collapse really fast if no one steps in. My part focuses on the Federal Reserve responded and why their actions were important. So basically, when COVID hit, a lot of businesses shut down, people lost jobs, and people stopped spending money. Restaurants, stores, and even big companies had to close or slow down. Because of that, the economy started shrinking really fast, and there was a lot of fear and uncertainty. When people are scared about money, they stop spending. And that makes things even worse because businesses lose even more income. The Federal Reserve, which controls things like interest rates and helps manage the economy, had to step in and try to fix the situation before it got worse. One of the main things they did was lower interest rates to almost zero. What that means is it became really cheap to borrow money. When borrowing money is cheaper, people are more likely to take loans and buy things like cars or houses. And businesses are more likely to invest in your companies, like hiring workers or expanding. Another thing they did was buy bonds, which is part of monetary policy. Basically, the Fed was putting money into the economy by buying government bonds and other financial assets. This gave banks more money, so they could continue lending to people and businesses. Without this, banks might have held onto their money, which would make the situation worse. To explain it in a simple way, it's kind of like economy was slowing down really badly, almost like a car running out of gas. And the Federal Reserve tried to give it a push to keep it moving. They were trying to keep money flowing so everything wouldn't just stop completely. This example is important because it shows that the Federal Reserve can do a lot during a crisis. They don't just sit back, they actually take action to try to protect the economy. Their decisions affect things like how easy it is to get a loan, or how much people spend, or even how many jobs are available. But at the same time, it also makes people question if they're doing too much. For example, when the Federal puts a lot of money into the economy, it can sometimes lead to inflation, which means prices go up. So while their actions can help in the short term, there could be problems later that are things that aren't managed carefully. Personally, I think this example connects to real life because everyone felt the effects of COVID in some way. Even if people don't pay attention to Federal Reserve, their decisions will still affect everyday life, like prices at the store, job opportunities, and how expensive things are. Overall, this world example from Limitless shows how important the Federal Reserve is, especially during hard times like COVID. Even though most people don't think about it, what they do affects things like jobs, prices, and how much people spend. So yeah, that's why this example matters. It shows how the Fed helps keep the economy from completely falling apart.
Today I'm going to be talking about a common misconception addressed in Chapter 1. If you ask anyone on the street what the Federal Reserve does, they'd probably give you some version of the same answer, like they keep prices from getting too high, or for nearly half a century that was actually true. The Fed was an institution built on a specific kind of trauma. In the late 1970s, inflation wasn't just a number. It was a national crisis everyone was worried about. Prices were spiraling, the dollar was weakening, and the public was losing faith. Then came Paul Volcker, the cigar-chomping Fed chair who broke inflation's back by cranking interest rate to 20%. It worked, but it left a permanent scar on Fed's DNA. For the next 40 years, every Fed official shared one common nightmare: the inflation ghost. They were convinced that if the economy got too hot, the ghost would return and destroy everything. This led us to the biggest misconception about the Fed, which Gina Smielek deconstructs in Chapter 1. Most people believe the Fed is a cautious referee, always ready to blow the whistle and take away the punch bowl, just as the party gets started. For decades, the Fed followed a preemptive strategy. They believed in something called the Phillips curve. It's a theory that says when unemployment goes down, inflation must go up. So the moment the job market looked healthy, the Fed would hike interest rates. They were intentionally slowing down the economy to prevent a price spike they assumed was coming. They thought they were being responsible, but in reality, they were actually just fighting a war that had already ended. Enter Jerome Powell. In Chapter 1, we see the moment this misconception finally hits a wall. It's 2019. Unemployment has dropped to 3.5, the lowest in 50 years. By every old rule in the book, inflation should have been roaring. Economists were waiting for the ghost to reappear, but the ghost never actually showed up. Inflation stayed stubbornly low, below the Fed's 2% target. Powell and his colleagues looked around the world and saw a new, more terrifying monster: deflation. They looked at Japan, where prices had stayed flat for decades, leading to a stagnant zombie economy. They realized that the safe path for the last 40 years, constantly worrying about inflation, had actually left Americans' economy too cold. This is a plot twist of Chapter 1. The Fed's biggest reserve isn't that you'll pay 10 cents more for a gallon of milk, or you'll stop expecting prices to ever rise. If inflation is too low, people delay spending. Businesses stop raising wages because they have no pricing power. But most importantly for the Fed, if inflation is actually at zero, interest rates are almost stuck at zero. This is called a deep freeze. When a recession hits a frozen economy, the Fed has no tools left to fight it. You can't just cut interest rate below zero. In Limitless, Smielek shows us the Fed that realized being tough on inflation had actually left them powerless. By the end of the chapter, the misconception is dead. The Fed stopped being the inflation hawk and started being a job market champion. They decided that too little inflation was more dangerous than too much. The psychological shift is what allowed them to go limitless in 2020. They stopped trying to prevent a 1970s disaster and started trying to prevent a 21st century collapse. The referee didn't just join the party, they decided to pay for the band. And this is the misconception addressed in Chapter 1.
Hi, I'm Charlotte Beavers, and I will be talking about the 3 takeaways from this book. We usually think of the Federal Reserve as a group of secretive, powerful bankers making huge decisions behind closed doors. But the first chapter of Limitless by Gina Smielek starts with something very different. Federal Chair Jerome Powell sitting in a squeaky elementary school gym in East Hartford, Connecticut, eating Mexican rice from a buffet tray. This wasn't just for show. It showed a big change in how the most powerful economic institution in the world sees its role. From this chapter, we can take away 3 main ideas that define the Federal in late 2019 or before times. Takeaway number 1. My first takeaway is that the modern Fed is no longer just a banker's bank that watches money flow. By 2019, it had become the most important group setting economic policy in the country. Its main job is still the dual mandate, keeping inflation low and employment high. But its influence is much bigger now. It acts like the government's largest economic think tank and also oversees the nation's biggest banks. Most importantly, it works as Wall Street's safety net, with the huge power to create money to support markets during a crisis. This almost limitless power is at the center of today's system, even if the exact limits aren't totally clear. The second takeaway is about the person in charge. Unlike past leaders, Jerome Powell is not a PhD economist. He's a lawyer and former investor who made millions in private equity. In Washington, he became known as a practical problem-solving thinker. During the 2011 debt ceiling crisis, he used detailed spreadsheets to show exactly when the government would run out of money, which helped bring clarity to a very divided situation. He was chosen by both parties, appointed by Barack Obama in 2012, and later picked as chair by Donald Trump because he could connect with people and make them feel heard. Some even called him Washington's best-liked man. Finally, there's the Fed Listens program, which shows a big shift in how the Fed communicates. In the past, leaders like Alan Greenspan believed in being confusing on purpose to keep a sense of mystery. But after the 2008 financial crisis, many people lost trust in the Fed. They felt it helped big banks more than regular people. To fix this, Powell started Fed Listens, where he visited places like food banks and school gyms to hear directly from everyday workers. In that East Hartford gym, he even encouraged an 18-year-old student to stay in school. This kind of outreach was meant to show the Fed wasn't just for Wall Street, it was also helping regular people by lowering unemployment without causing inflation. In the conclusion, by late 2019, Powell was giving hopeful speeches by continuing job growth. He stood in that gym as someone who had figured out the before times. But by the end of the chapter, there's a clear sense of irony. Powell had no idea that a global pandemic was coming soon, and it would push his limitless power to the test in ways that made these small community events feel far away and almost nostalgic. Thank you so much for listening.